Looking out and seeing all the visiting mothers, some of you, and for some of you, you have visiting daughters. I'm kind of wishing that I'd written more of an ode to Mother's Day sermon, but that's not exactly what this is this morning. But it is nice to see mothers and daughters sitting together who don't often get to every Sunday. On a day when motherhood is the focus, in sometimes overly simplistic ways, those who are grieving over their mothers or who've had painful experiences of mothering or being mothered, those who aren't mothers but wished to be, or perhaps chose not to be and feel somewhat judged by society for that choice. There are lots of folks who can feel unfairly relegated to the background, even more than usual on a day like today. But the cult of womanhood and motherhood in our culture often makes those of us who are in the thick of mothering, who should feel the most clear and happy on Mother's Day, feel a little bit like frauds. Because the reality of our mothering doesn't often match our own expectations, much less the ones we imagine everyone has of us. And it also doesn't often match the image of effortlessness that it feels like we should project, if not live out. And also, it doesn't match the happy moments on each other's Facebook feeds. And I have to admit that I am guilty of mostly cherry picking and choosing the cutest moments and the brightest smiles and the sibling harmony moments to post to everyone out there in the world. And when I have a crafty idea from Pinterest, I tend to only take a picture of it when it goes quite well. The meltdowns and the last-minute not-so-organic dinners or the outright domestic failures don't really make the timeline so often. And we wonder, with all of that, are we worthy of the fuss about Mother's Day? Yet we do feel gratified, or I should speak for myself. It does feel nice to be acknowledged at the effort and for what the role is and what it takes to think through that. But it also makes me think about what a difference the angle of the camera can make. Who you're looking at on a day like Mother's Day and where you're looking from on a day like Mother's Day. In a recent Huffington Post article on mothering entitled "The Mom Stays in the Picture," the young mother who wrote it shares this. I'm everywhere in my kids' young lives, and yet I have very few pictures of me with them. Someday I won't be here, and I don't know if that someday is tomorrow or 30 or 40 or 50 years from now, but I want them to have pictures of me. I want them to see the way I looked at them, to see how much I loved them. I'm not perfect to look at, and I'm not perfect to love, but I am perfectly their mother. When I look at pictures of my own mother, I don't look at cellulite or hair debacles. I just see her kind eyes, her open-mouthed, joyful smile, her familiar clothes. She goes on to remind us, too, that although we do tend to post our best moments online, what doesn't get posted isn't always because it's imperfect or bad or shameful. What doesn't always get noticed, much less posted, are those little rituals, the little tokens of care that we don't always even notice for ourselves, but we remember from our mothers. They might be too routine or maybe too intimate to share. Those moments in the grocery store where you break down and buy the snack you really shouldn't, but you know they love so much. Or going in at night after they're finally asleep and pulling up the covers that have been tossed off. Again, what a difference a camera angle can make. Sometimes we choose our camera angles too carefully, and sometimes I think it is completely thoughtless. In today's scripture, as I've been turning this story over in my mind, I think that the writers, who are kind of the directors if you're thinking about cameras, might have chosen some of the camera angles wrong. The story starts with Paul and Silas heading out to pray, and a young slave girl follows along. She was a fortune teller, we're told, and she was making loud comments about what they were doing. And although it seemed like she was speaking the truth, saying, hey, these people are slaves of God and they're doing good things, apparently it annoyed Paul. At least that's what the text says. So this young slave girl comes into our view through Paul's annoyance. And that we know of, or at least he doesn't express that he was annoyed that she was a slave. What he expresses is his annoyance that she was following them and talking loudly. So in response to this, he prays to rid her of her apparently not God-given talent of fortune-telling, or divination, as some of the texts say. And it works. The spirit is removed from her. And we don't really hear anything more about her in this passage or elsewhere in the Bible, because once she's cured of what Paul thought ailed her, the camera moves on to her owners, who began to argue with Paul and Silas about how disruptive they'd been. And they were disruptive because they had taken away a pretty handy revenue stream from them for this slave girl of theirs who apparently brought in money telling fortunes that they benefited from. So they were mad. So here is another action that's motivated by annoyance in this story, by inconvenience to one person's agenda and goals. And at no point is the girl asked what she thinks. Did she even want to have that talent removed? Was she being mishandled because she now was less handy to them? The owners wanted someone to pay for their inconvenience. But the camera doesn't return to the girl. It follows Paul and Silas, who end up in jail to satisfy her owners. That night, after the jailer tucks them into the centermost cell and shackles their feet, Paul and Silas begin to sing, perhaps because they're afraid. But the text's focus on them singing that others might hear them makes it sound to me, or makes me wonder, whether their singing was almost more of an evangelistic bent rather than self-soothing. However, they sang and the earthquake came. And here I think the camera footage would be pretty interesting, with walls falling down and chains coming off and prisoners running around in a panic. But the camera shifts to the jailer, who's in a panic because he knows that he'll be responsible for whoever's not accounted for. And especially, I think, Paul and Silas. But he seemed to make a connection between the singing and the earthquake and Paul and Silas' decision to stay in jail, foregoing their opportunity to run. The connection the jailer made was to honor and respect the God of these two men, and so he asked for himself and his household to be baptized, and they were converted. But I think there's a lot more to the prison break than the jailer here. The miraculous events in this story are this exorcism of the spirit of divination, and also this earthquake that frees the prisoners. But what the camera reveals is almost more a setup for Paul and Silas to go to jail so that this jailer might be saved, it seems to me. Over and over in the Bible and in the Gospels, freeing people from captivity, whether from guilt or evil spirits or prison, is said to be holy work, the work that God intends. And this kind of freeing does happen in this story, but it doesn't seem to be the focus. Because the people being saved aren't the main characters or the major stakeholders in their time and place. The ones who are freed are this slave girl and a bunch of criminals who don't get names in the story. I'm both inspired and kind of depressed that Paul does this God work of freeing people almost inadvertently and out of annoyance. It's inspiring because it's reassuring to know that good things can happen despite motives, despite ourselves, despite annoyance. If there's a mood that I operate out of more than I used to since mothering, I have to admit it's probably annoyance. I don't say it proudly, but I am annoyed when I trip over 8 pairs of tiny shoes when I come in the door. I am annoyed when bedtime takes an hour longer than I was hoping. I'm annoyed when the yelling in the back seat means I missed the last paragraph of that NPR story that sounded like it was headed a pretty cool direction. And I can make bad decisions out of annoyance. Rejecting a child's request just because, instead of truly inspecting the validity of the request. But at times I acquiesce to requests out of annoyance, just to make the wheedling stop. And sometimes I end up with a magical moment because I did that. Sometimes I end up with some time inside my daughter's world because of it. Sometimes I think it's good that my annoyance goads me to do something I didn't want to do. Because sometimes the only motivation that can get through my fatigue is annoyance. But yes, it's also depressing, in my own case and in Paul's, how quickly we are prone to annoyance at others' behavior, such that we are blind to their deepest needs. Paul heard the wheedling of the slave girl, and he overlooked her servitude. He simply responded to the issue that impacted her status with the religious institution and its practices. His action made her pure again. It restored her to good favor, but it didn't restore her freedom. It didn't really get to the root of her suffering, I would imagine, looking at it from my 21st century eyes. And the story of liberation from captivity is that whole prison full of prisoners. I mean, depending on the commentator and the version, it's unclear whether Paul and Silas were the only ones who remained in the prison. But some would say that they were the only ones and that other prisoners did gain their freedom because of that earthquake that they sang into being and which was credited to God directly intervening on their behalf. But Paul and Silas chose to stay in jail. The liberation in the story wasn't for them in that physical sense. From the perspective of a nation, our nation, with one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, I tend to have a viewpoint of those in jail with some mercy. I do think there's reason to wonder often whether punishment is always commensurate with the crime, whether those in prison are there justly or because prejudice about their skin color or class made them more likely to pay for their crimes than other people who'd done the same things, or barred them from a sympathetic hearing. Jesus, I think, had a high view of prisoners. He died alongside them. He spoke to them no differently than to any others. He said visiting prisoners was one of the marks of those who would be saved, and that neglecting them was one of the marks of those who would be damned. It's language we don't use very often, but it's strong language in the Matthew text. In this country, 500 out of 100,000 people in the general population are in prison. Now, compare that to other countries who are comparable to us. Most of those countries, the rate's more like 100 out of 100,000. So that's 5 times higher for us. And that's the general population. For African American males in this country, it's 3,000 per 100,000, despite the fact that that does not reflect the ratio of numbers in our population. It's a major problem. I wonder whether these disproportionate numbers are due to decisions being made out of annoyance and inconvenience, rather than looking deeper. Decisions skewed because the camera is always trained on someone or something else. Decisions about one person's life being made because of the perceived entitlement of another group or person. For the prisoners in today's story, the decisions and actions revolved around Paul and Silas, two men who, for all intents and purposes, chose to go to prison. As Roman citizens, which they chose not to disclose in this passage, they do disclose it in the passage following this, which isn't printed. But as Roman citizens, they might have prevented their captivity, because that was one of the major charges against them. But they were making a point, a protest, a witness with their jail time. And such acts of solidarity are important and good. But the camera stays trained on the people in power and not the people most affected by the decision, knowing that it's those people who will inspire others in power to respond and act. I keep feeling like in this story the director chose wrong. The real action was going on in the background of this scene. If you look closely, you can see it, usually looking past Paul and Silas, whom the camera is trained on so intently. But if you look at the extras and the cast members with the smaller part, I think that's where a lot of the liberation is happening here. There you'll see the unfolding drama of this slave girl, whose story was decided largely for her, not by her, by someone deciding that they knew her best interests better than she did, even though it meant she lost the one thing that was valued by the people who had the most power over her life. There, too, in the background, you'll see a bunch of prisoners, presumably some running home, while the jailer acts upon his shame and his most famous prisoners. I can imagine the prisoners, wrongly and rightly accused alike, some eager to be home to families, some perhaps wondering whether they would be welcomed if they did take this opportunity to go home. Those are two huge but largely unexamined stories of liberation in this text, I think. So where is the hope in the story, or what might the message be for us today? Good things do happen, miracles even, and sometimes they arise even from our less noble intentions. Good things can still happen. We are not in control of the consequences of our actions. It's one of the mysteries of life, that sometimes our most well-thought-out decisions seemingly end poorly for ourselves or for the people or situations that we cared so much about. But I think that there's a message here about paying attention to that which annoys us and that which we fear. Paul was annoyed, and he acted upon that feeling. The jailer was in fear for his reputation and his life, and he acted upon that feeling. Instead of shaming ourselves about annoyance and fear, I wonder if there might be some potential in acknowledging the power they have to provoke us into action and harnessing it instead of repressing it. Change happens when we can't tolerate something anymore, and when we see our fate mingled with something we feel we can affect. If we see that our entanglement with something is leading us to danger, we will find a way to act. Sometimes the action we choose is to deny or to run, but when we see others whom we genuinely value entangled in a predicament or injustice, or when we perceive ourselves to be truly at risk, we do somehow find ways to act effectively, despite the fact that we don't always know ahead of time what the solution could possibly be. Although I generally avoid conflict, I can somehow muster it with my girls. It doesn't always look pretty or particularly mature, but they genuinely touch me and motivate me. And because I cannot fathom life without them, I'm forced to act in response to conflict and annoyance. Because to deny or run away would be to lose a relationship. And I think it's with that eye, the mother's eye, the fierce mama bear that's within all of us, mothers or not, that we must see the injustices of the world. Or else we don't see the entanglement, It doesn't touch us or move us, or sufficiently annoy us even. For to be annoyed means to be up against something, or rather to be vexed because something is coming up against us and keeping us from doing what we want or staying where we'd like to stay. To see with a fierce mother eye is to get mixed up with it in ways that we aren't always eager to be, mixed up with the sorrows of the world. I want to be provoked to action, not just by my own daughters, but by the devastation of the earthquake in Bangladesh and the conditions of the workers who make cheap clothing for me. I want to be provoked to action by global warming and fracking in my own state, by child abuse and elderly abuse, by wars and conflicts across the globe that I have a hand in based on my lifestyle choices. I want my director's eye to begin to see the bigger picture, to change the camera angle, to celebrate with those who are freed from captivity, that I too might be freed from the prison of my collusion with the power I have access to in the world, due to my skin color and class and education, that I too might be freed from the prison I choose in abiding by the unspoken rules of what it means to maintain privilege, that I too might be freed from the prison of the petty annoyances that prick only my convenience and comfort, that I too might be rightfully annoyed by injustice and undeserved pain, that I might awake the true capacity of my conscience, which is to see, to acknowledge, to rectify, and to act. So I thank you, God, for earthquakes and annoyances that produce miracles beyond me and despite us. Give us the insight and willingness to work toward consciously participating in your work of freeing the captives, healing the injured, feeding the poor. Give us your eyes, fierce Mother God. Be with us as we change our camera angles. Amen.